Well, this evening we are blessed to have in our company a statesman whose courage and intellect are already having an outsized impact in Washington. Over the weekend, I was with my longtime friend Stu Epperson, the chairman of Salem Media, and Stu said to me, wouldn't it be terrific if we had a presidential candidate that had the business acumen of Donald Trump and Carly Fiorina and the conservative legislative credentials of Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, and Rand Paul? Now that would be really powerful. Well, you need look no further. He's not running for president yet, but Senator Ben Sasse of Nebraska brings an accomplished business background, an incredible track record of success as president of Midland University, and now an impressive record as an articulate defender of America's constitutional principles on the Senate floor. It's my honor to introduce to you United States Senator Ben Sasse.
Thank you, Chris. I feel like I need a Make America Great Again hat after that. Truly, it is a bit daunting to stand before this room. I'm not a politician yet, or I'm new to it, so I don't really know how to pander. But there are many, many people in this room to whom I feel I owe a great debt of gratitude, even though most of you I've never met before. You've invested in the little platoons, as we heard from one of our students tonight. You've invested your time and your energies and your money funding and building that great textured Tocquevillian civil society that really does define American greatness. And so I feel incredibly honored to get to speak to you tonight and get to tell you thank you. So my overarching purpose is to say thank you for the things that you invest in. This is an incredibly special organization. I wasn't a part of it, and I'm actually not certain if ISI was at Harvard in the early 1990s when I was an undergrad. But I feel like I am a student who's been blessed generationally by teachers and uncles and aunts and grandparents and descendant organizations of things that many of you have invested in. So I am not allowed to actively fundraise, so I can't ask for a gift on behalf of this organization, but I can tell you thank you for all the ways that I've benefited from the things that you've invested in. So that's one of my first purposes here tonight. Please. I was telling my kids what ISI was about. Melissa and I are blessed to have a 14-year-old daughter, an 11-year-old daughter, and a 4-year-old son. And we, I think, are the only family in the U.S. Senate that is trying a family commute. Let me tell you, this is a terrible idea. It's only less bad than the two alternatives. I don't want to raise my kids in Washington, D.C. No offense to all of you city dwellers. I just don't know where you walk beans into tassel corn in your cities, and it's the only way I know how to get kids' character. But I also don't want to be away from them Monday to Friday every week. So with my new calling and my commute, Melissa and I have worked out an arrangement where I take one of the 3 kids with me every week. So we alternate and rotate who gets the short straw of being dad's date for the week. And I say short straw, they are only 60-40 preferring to be in Nebraska every week, so they kind of like going to DC and some of the responsibilities that they have there. Although this week, for the first time in a long time, I don't have anybody with me because Alex, my 11-year-old, was due to be with me this week. She had gotten the whole explanation of what ISI is and why she should thank all of you for what you do when we're here tonight. And then it turned out hockey schedules back in Nebraska this week precluded it, and she stayed home. I'll brag for a second. She is the only girl on her boys' travel hockey team. But usually I would lament being on the road without my daughters or without one of my kids, but this week, frankly, I'm holding a bit of a grudge against her, and so I don't mind that much that she's not with me. A couple of weeks ago when we were in DC, Jay Nordlinger there was a book party for Jay Nordlinger's new book. If you haven't read it yet, it's called Children of Monsters, and it's this brilliant idea for a book. He looked at 20 dictators, totalitarian dictators over the last few centuries. Most of them are 20th century or current dictators. And he asked himself the question, as a good magazine writer always looking for a paycheck would be asking himself, how can I string together a bunch of articles and call it a book? He asked himself, I wonder what happens to the children of dictators. And, spoiler alert, it's bad. You don't want to be the child of a dictator. Your highest aspiration is to take over the family business and become a dictator, which is not the good, the true, or the beautiful. But more often what happens is you have a promiscuous, horrible person for a father who has lots and lots of offspring, and they're all wondering how they plan to kill each other. So being a child of a dictator is a bad thing, but we're at the book party and Jay's a compelling, interesting guy, and he was telling a little story, and I see my 11-year-old just steal a copy of the book, and I thought I'll pay for that later. I'm kind of glad she wants to read it. And it took me 3 days to realize the real reason she wanted to read it, not just because she thought it was a fascinating topic, but because she knew that people who would see an cute little 11-year-old girl reading this book would stop and ask about it. And so she has learned to deadpan without even looking up. As people see this book and they ask her a question, she simply says, "It's my autobiography." So, I don't mind that Alex is not with me tonight. I want to give a little bit of context for the kinds of things that ISI and many of you in your other philanthropic efforts and your institution building efforts, I want to give a little bit of context for what I think the world of the next decade plus looks like. And it's a scary, scary environment to be heading into. And I want to bring together two things that might not seem like they fit together exactly. I think our title for tonight is something like The American Idea and the Problem with Grade 13. And I want to talk about why we face a really particularly great challenge, why we are at a truly critical moment. It's always the case that people think the moment they're at is the most critical in all of time. I look at Dr. Bennett and think about all the ways I've learned from him and both his philosophical teachings, but also the historical context in which he can place things. And historians, one of our jobs, I'm a historian by training, is to tell people that oftentimes things aren't going through as much discontinuity as you might think they are. People always think their moment is unique. And we face great challenges at the present moment. I'm not going to talk about policy hardly at all tonight, but at the policy level, we face a jihadi threat. We face miniaturization of nuclear technologies. We face cyber threats, where when you talk to intelligence and national security leadership in private, overwhelmingly the largest fear in our intelligence community and at the Pentagon, overwhelmingly the largest fear they have in the middle and the long term is our vulnerability to cyber attack. We face a resurgent Putin. And all of these problems are happening, these national security problems are happening against a backdrop of a Cold War that ended in 1989 and a Soviet Union that dissolved in 1991. We are 24 years past that. We are 14 years past 9/11 and the sort of realization that non-state actors are as able to play on the global stage as state actors are now. And yet sort of Tom Friedman, the world is flat potential for little death cults to actually carry out massively significant attacks across the globe. And we have no national security strategy. We have no shared consensus. This is not a Republican senator criticizing a Democratic administration. I mean, over the course of the last quarter century, we have not, as a people, come to grips with the nature of the national security challenges of the next decades and half century. We face policy challenges in our entitlement programs where we are probably 2.5 weeks away from Republicans and Democrats screaming at each other about the debt ceiling. And it's a big deal, and yet it's a tiny deal compared to all the off-book obligations of our federal government. The entitlement programs are 3.5 times larger than all the publicly held bond indebtedness numbers that feed in to the debt ceiling numbers. We could go through a litany of policy challenges. But I would submit to you that these kinds of policy challenges, though acute, every generation has those. What's different about the moment that we're at right now is there is a convergence of two different things happening. One of them is a crisis of confidence, and worse, an unawareness, an orphanhood of the American idea. We face a hangover of the 1960s in ways that President Reagan saw 15 years into that hangover, but we are now 50 years into that hangover, where in a republic, in a small R Republican tradition like ours, You are always only one generation away from the extinction of freedom, because America is an idea. And if we don't teach that idea, if we don't transmit that idea to the next generation, it evaporates. And the greatness of America drifts into something different. We regress to something before the American founding and the American Constitution and that framework for ordered liberty. And so on the one hand, we have an atrophy of confidence in and understanding of the American idea. But on the other hand, we have an institutional drift going on that I'm going to submit to you tonight is an echo of major economic change of which we're not even really collectively aware. We are drifting toward the perpetuation of adolescence into adulthood in ways that are going to try to bureaucratize childhood and now bureaucratize young adulthood in ways that cause crises that aren't just creedal, they aren't just cognitive about what you don't understand about the American idea. They are habitual about the fact that some of what is so great about the American idea is it comports with reality and with nature and with what free people have always done as they became independent adults. And if we insulate our children and our young adults from having to have any experiences of becoming adults, the hill that we have to climb to get back to a place where the American idea can be recovered is so daunting that we dare not think of it. So I would like to talk about three things, but Chris was clear to me as I came up here that there's a trap door under the podium, and we all want to see Dr. Billington receive the award that he deserves, and we're going to try to move to the conversation hour by just minutes after 9 o'clock. So I have ambitions to do more than can be done tonight, so I want to name three things that I aspire to, only two of which will really accomplish. Number one, I want to talk a tiny little bit about what the American idea is and why it's imperiled. Number two, I'd like to set the stage a little bit for history. I'd like to set a little bit of the historical stage for what grade 13 is and how it's an echo of the mass institutionalization of secondary schooling over the course of the last century plus. And why those two come together is the third thing that I won't finish, but we'll drift to question and answer there, and maybe it'll inform some of what we discuss in the after reception. But more significantly, I hope it causes you to redouble your efforts and your concern for the causes in which you invest, because I think this is an especially critical moment for the kinds of small platoons in which you invest, chief among them ISI. So I want to, like a professor might do, I want to name a whole bunch of adjacent topics that we're not going to touch on at all, but that would be useful to if we could spend tomorrow together as well. The Democrats are talking about, this is not a partisan speech, but the Democrats are talking now, 3 of the 4 candidates in their field, now that Webb is out and Biden is out, 3 of the 4 have proposals for free college. We're not going to be able to talk about exactly what that means. We're not going to be able to talk about the definition of free and why this is going to cause fissures inside the Democratic Party that I don't think most of us have sensed yet, largely because the media loves to talk about intra-Republican fighting, and intra-Democratic squabbling always gets pushed under the rug. But there is a great regressive element to the idea behind free college that's going to cause serious internal tensions for the Democrats, because ultimately free college is about a transfer of wealth from non-college going people to college going people. And even though that income ladder may be sliding down, ultimately there are union versus elite Democratic expert type fights coming in the Democratic Party around the nature of the entitlement expansions they would like to pursue. We're not going to have a chance to talk much about the psychological problems with a universalization of ongoing dependence. Chris mentioned microaggressions and trigger warnings and the like. But ultimately, there are deeply psychologically harming things that happen when 15-year-olds are not encouraged to become more independent as they become 18. And 18-year-olds are not encouraged to become more independent as they become 20. And the idea that institutions of higher education should resemble something more like a mental hospital, protecting people from all the harms of having to interact with ideas they don't like, is deeply psychologically problematic. And most sociologists, I think that most sociologists historically would talk about what it means to become an adult, right? There's physical maturation, There's the fact that your body changes. There's the fact that you ultimately stop going to school, or you get your first job, or you become economically independent, or you procreate for the first time, or you marry for the first time, or you form a household for the first time, or you live inside your parents' household for the last time. You could list a dozen of these coming-of-age moments. We can think of more tribal peoples where the big hunt is a coming-of-age moment, rites of passage, religious confirmation. There are many different things that happen that define the transition from dependency to independent adult living. And throughout many people groups in history and across different civilizations on the planet today, these things happen in different orders, right? Extended families and kin networks, and when you marry, and when you leave your parents' house, and when you finally leave school, and when you're truly economically self-sufficient. There's not a morality to the sequencing of many of these things, but there is a morality to some of them. And right now, one of the great problems we have is that we're not thinking about those things hardly at all, and we're telling people that they should remain dependent psychologically, potentially forever. We're not going to have time to talk about that tonight. We're not going to have time to talk in any great detail about the decline of youth labor, though that's a huge crisis in our time. I joked about my kids needing to walk beans and to tassel corn, but fundamentally, talk to the other people at your table, the people that you respect, the people that you regard as heroes, as I regard many of you in this room as intellectual heroes and champions. Find people that live really meaningful lives that can't point to hard work experiences they had when they were coming of age. It's really difficult to find people who are healthy as adults who somehow became an adult without ever having worked, pardon me. So there are a range of issues that we're not going to be able to talk about, but that I think are adjacent to the kinds of challenges that we face. What is the American idea? The American idea is pretty unique in human history. The American founding was a big, bold claim that most peoples and most governments in the history of the world had been wrong about the nature of power and the nature of freedom. The American founding was a claim that even though there may have been some Greek moments and some Swiss medieval moments where city-states had some conception of liberty, the American founding said, if you actually look back across human history, most people in human history have said, the king is free because might makes right. If you have a monopoly on power, you can do what you want. And everyone else in those societies were what? We didn't call them citizens. What do we call them? They were dependent subjects. And so you passively needed the king to give you freedom. And so if you wanted to found a business, if you wanted to marry someone, if you wanted to start a not-for-profit, you needed permission from somebody. The passive assumption was prohibition. The passive assumption was, if I want to start a business, I of course need a charter because it's illegal to run that business unless the king has sanctioned it. And so I go and I supplicate before the king in his court, and he decides and they decide whether or not to give me the right to start that business, by which we would say today, that's bizarre, the voluntary transaction between these two people, that's the nature of freedom. And the American founders said, when they looked at that world, there's something wrong with this picture. Because it doesn't comport with the dignity of people who are created in the image of God. And fundamentally, people have been endowed with certain inalienable rights, and God gives us those rights, government does not. Government is a tool. It is our shared project by which we go out and we secure our liberties. Government is a tool to provide a framework for ordered liberty so that free people can go become independent people living fully flowering lives. And the American idea said, and think about the debates we had around the Constitution about whether or not you should enumerate any of these rights. Because what's the danger in enumerating rights? Your list will never be long enough. And so our Constitution actually doesn't define any of the rights because the Constitution is the way that we give the government limited authorities. And everything that we don't give to the government are rights that we still retain. And so the Bill of Rights is not in the Constitution proper. It's the first 10 amendments, just in case you were confused about some of the most important ones. And yet, when they said, so what should we list first? They had to list 5 things in the First Amendment because they couldn't come up with any one that could be listed first alone. So religious liberty, speech, press, assembly, the right of redress of grievances, which means lobbying. Those 5 freedoms are all listed as the first freedoms because there's no way that you can get this list complete. And so we want to make clear that limited government is not because we're obsessed about government, it's because we're obsessed about the maximal nature of human freedom and human dignity and human potential. And so the American experience with limited government is not about government, it's about people and dignity and potential and the full lives that God envisions for people created in His image to live. And so limited government is just a means to that end. That's the American idea. And it had unbelievable results. We always think we won the revolution, in the late 1770s, early 1780s, and you remember that historical moment, the Articles of Confederation. They failed, but were they there 6 years? Were they there 8 years? And so when we said tonight, and one of the students mentioned how many years we've been at this, 227 is the right way to count, right? Because 1789 is the moment at which there's clarity about what we're doing, but to the Europeans, there wasn't clarity in 1789. The English were distracted. They were always distracted by the French, right? And so they thought these crazy people living in the hinterlands hadn't really won their freedom. The English were bored. And so they went back home for a while, and the War of 1812 is sort of the sequel, where they come to put us down and put us back in our place. And ultimately, freedom is truly secured. It's fitting that it's the Madisonian moment, right? It's the Madison administration when he's the author of our Constitution. And in the 18-teens, it becomes clear that America really is going to be free, but nobody's still paying us much attention. And then in the 1820s and in the 1830s, there's a market revolution, and there's a transportation revolution, and there are engineering revolutions centering around canals and whatnot. And the Europeans look across the sea and they say, who are these people? And how did those crazy people start to innovate in ways that isn't just about religious liberty, which is what many of them had originally projected, but there's actually economic flowering going on there. How could that be? So Alexis de Tocqueville comes to the New World as essentially a travel writer, right? That's the way to think of what Tocqueville's doing. He's writing travel stories to explain what America is to Europeans and French in particular who are fascinated by this experiment. And so Democracy in America, the 1,500-page book, is really just a compilation of all of his work. This is where Jay Nordlinger got the idea for Children of Monsters. Magazine articles can add up to a book. And so Tocqueville comes to America to explain American dynamism to Europeans, and what does he do? He goes to Washington, D.C., because if you have a fully vibrant society, it must be because you have greater bureaucrats than anyone else, right? And that's what Tocqueville believes. And so he goes to Washington and he finds a swamp. And in the swamp, he says, actually, none of the innovation of these American people really appears to come from Washington, D.C. I must go elsewhere. There are 25 states at the time, and he travels to 17 or 18 of them, and he writes back to Europe, and he says, I've found the meaning of America. It is the Rotary Club. What Tocqueville believes he has found is that these people have some new way to associate together and to trade and to commerce and to build civil society. And he says, it turns out that many of us in Europe used to think there was this continuum between collectivism, which means the government's in charge, and isolated individualism, which seems really lonely. How could you ever do shared projects if the government isn't in charge? And he said, and then I found the Rotary Club. These people believe something incredible. You can have communal life. You can have civil society. You can have group projects by the ISI marketing campaigns. What is he saying? He said you can have group projects by voluntarism. That's, if you wanted to subtitle Democracy in America, that's what it's about. It's the voluntarist spirit of these Americans who came together and persuade other people to marry them. Persuade them to donate to their not-for-profit. Persuade them that they have a better mousetrap and they want to buy their product or their service. And the American dynamism of the 1830s is just a working out of an idea that was clear to those who were drafting the Constitution, and it should be still our idea today. Now I want to pause, and I want to talk about something that seems totally unrelated, and that is the rise of grade 13. What is grade 13? As a college president, it scared me to death to hear state bureaucrats in our state government in Lincoln talking about grade 13. I really had never heard the term until I was a college president. It turns out about 41 governors out of 50 in the country have something called a P16 initiative. There used to be a bureaucracy in most state governments called K-12. And then P16 is a way of saying, let's debate early childhood and let's debate childhood literacy issues. And there's a lot of really important stuff there that we do need to debate. But let's also talk about the transition to higher education, because we're entering a world where probably everybody needs to go to college, is the passive assumption of many of the state government bureaucrats. And so many of these folks are very well motivated, mind you. I want to be clear, I'm critical of their idea, but I'm not critical of many of their motives. It turns out that the transition from grade 12 to freshman year in college doesn't work very well. In my own state of Nebraska, over the last 15 years, the percentage of graduating high school seniors that go to college as their next step after May of their senior year on their way to August of their freshman year in college, that number has grown something like 25% over the last 15 years. Do you know how many more people are graduating from college right now in Nebraska than 15 years ago? None. It's almost exactly flat as a share of population. What we're doing is we're shifting people from their high school graduation without any self-conscious choice about work and how they'll be educated and how they'll learn and what's career training and what's intellectual development. And we're just shuffling them into the first year of college, and then huge percentages of them, almost a third of fall freshmen, don't become fall sophomores. And so there is a desire to help that transition, and that's a noble desire. Here's the problem with the theory. The theory is that one homogenized institutional form is the right form for what every 19-year-old needs. I want to tell you something that happened to me when I was 19. I read Alexis de Tocqueville for the first time. How many 19-year-olds, how many grade 13ers are reading Alexis de Tocqueville right now? Not very many, because we are trying to standardize the institutional process. This isn't new. This is an echo of the way we got mass homogenized secondary schooling, which is much more defensible than the mass movement we're headed toward right now, but even it we should question. And so I would suggest to you that the rise of mass secondary education is an echo of economics, not of self-conscious thought like ISI is trying to bring about what ideas you need to be a fully participating, truly free adult in American life. Throughout human history, there have really only been about 4 kinds of economies. There were hunter-gatherers, there were settled agrarian farmers in small villages, there was the rise of cities and big tool economies, and there's whatever the heck we're entering now. None of us really know what it is. But the IT or the service economy, the freelance nation, the sharing economy, which is something like this, we can describe it more by its form than by its intent. As recently as the late 1970s, pardon me, as recently as the late 70s, average duration at a firm was still nearly 3 decades. Among us in this room, and even more significantly among those who are a generation behind most of us in this room, average duration at a firm is now 3.8 years. And for kids whose hands I shook in May of last year, May of 2014, Paul McNulty's a mentor of mine and what he gets to do at Grove City now, when kids come across the podium and you shake their hand as they exit college now, demographers and statisticians and economists will tell you that they are going to change industries, not just jobs, 3 times between college graduation and age 30. The experience of workers in the American economy forevermore is going to be more and more rapid job transition. And there's a lot about that that's great and dynamic. There's a lot about that that's horrifying. And when you're scared about it, and politicians lie to you and say if only they had more power centrally, they could solve this problem and smooth out all the bumpiness in your life, there is a great societal desire for comfort. And politicians are going to make promises in this time. And when we look back to how we got to mass secondary education, you go to the last transition. We don't really know anything about what happened when you went from hunter-gatherers to settled agrarian farmers. We didn't have alphabets at that time. But when we went from farming communities to urban communities, when the big tool economy of industrialization rose between 1870 and 1940, it was one of the most disruptive times in recorded human history. Because 15 to 24-year-old males are scary. And as they leave farms and they go to cities, people thought this is going to be hugely disruptive. And it was. But it turns out it wasn't as scary as they thought, because once you got your first job in a big tool economy, you tended to stay there until death or retirement. So we had this moment of social dislocation from 1870 to 1940, but it was a one-time phenomenon. What we're going to deal with now is the fears people had about that moment every 3 years forever. How did society respond to the scariness of late antebellum and late prebellum and early antebellum, and then rise of cities scariness about these new kids coming into cities? We created a mass schooling experience to be sure that everybody had a place to go when there were no jobs for them. When you were 14 and 15 and 16 and 17, we wanted to be sure that you weren't idle, that you weren't drunk. Prohibition is the same part of this problem. We wanted to be sure that the children of immigrants were Americanized in certain ways that are more problematic than beneficial, but understandable why, not Americanization as problematic, but the way we tried to Americanize in that moment for immigrant children of Catholics in particular. That moment was a moment that was about fear of what to do with these people who didn't have jobs. And lest any of you students accuse me of a Marxist analysis, I need to give one particular fact at this point. There's a kind of narrative out there that actually public schooling comes from poor people forcing rich people to share the wealth with them. That's not really where most of public schooling comes from. Most of the history of public schooling comes from places like Beverly, Massachusetts, where this assembly line ran for 2 hours, and then there was a 4-minute potty break. And the assembly line ran for 4 hours, and there was a 2-minute potty break. And guess what these passing periods were in the schools for the children of the immigrants? Let's have 2-hour classes and 4-minute passing periods so they can be standardized and habituated into the experience of what it means to become dependent on the large tool factory economy. We needed literacy. We needed many of the things that drove that movement. At this moment, we face a different kind of challenge. We face a challenge and a choice about what the rise of this grade 13 moment is going to look like. And I strive hard not to quote President Obama critically too much because it seems rote and predictable. But in this place, you can't forget the president's famous line about what American exceptionalism is. When he says, "Sure, I believe in American exceptionalism," in the same way that the Greeks probably believe in Greek exceptionalism and the Brits believe in British exceptionalism. Except that's exactly the opposite of what American exceptionalism meant. And his understanding of what wasn't American exceptionalism is deeply wedded with the philosophy that was used by the Democratic National Committee in the 2012 election to celebrate so much of his first term. When they quoted repeatedly on videos as President Obama would be introduced traveling the country, they would quote the great the troubling but infamous Barney Frank line that government is just another word for those things we choose to do together. That's an abandonment of the core American understanding of what government is. Government is the tool by which we create a framework for liberty to guard those natural liberties of the people so they can go out and build great and independent and free lives. And at this moment, as we drift toward a larger conversation about whether or not we are going to see a revivification of the American idea of Tocquevillian freedom and independence and civil society and mediating institutions, all those ways that we form real communities, communities of the heart and communities of the soul, communities of voluntarism, not communities of compulsory institutions, we are facing a time where the government's solution to many problems is to say, let us standardize more. Let us become more European in the way we embrace the future. That is a regression from an American idea that said, no, the true greatness of America is the ability of people to build these institutions together and to fully flower. And if you think about the architecture of institutions in higher education and in the economy, what we need at this moment is more innovation. We need more entrepreneurs. We need more civil society. We need more striving for independence. We need more ISIs, not more homogenization and standardization of that coming of age moment. And so I know that I'm going to turn this over to Chris to drift us into some questions. But let me just say, once again, thank you for the ways that you invest, because your investment in ISI is not just about ISI. It is about the full flowering of an America that has always been about the private sector. And the private sector isn't just the for-profit entities that make it possible for you to make these other investments, but it is about the private sector that is all the civil society and mediating institutions that have defined Tocqueville American greatness for 2 centuries. Thank you.
Wow, that was terrific, Ben. How many of you would like to stay over and we can just talk to Ben all day tomorrow? He can unpack some of this. I have to give kudos to Alf Regner. It was Alf's idea to invite Ben, and he was the perfect choice. We've got a ton of questions. We don't have time for all of them, and there's a couple that are somewhat related. One is actually from Ed Fulner, and he says, there's the famous line that Lord Keynes mentions that, basically we're indebted to the ideas of some defunct intellectual or economist. And another one is a similar question having to do with a book. You mentioned Democracy in America, but who other than Tocqueville and Democracy in America are, a writer, an author, or, a book that had tremendous influence on you?
Well, again, I joked before that I don't yet know how to pander, but I want to come up with projects that Ed has been a part of, because my chief of staff, a guy named Derek Morgan, is Ed Fulner's former chief of staff. So I feel like I have an echo of dependence on so many folks in this room. I won't answer a particular book, because the Book of Virtues author will come up here next and explain why I didn't name the right antecedent to that book. But I will say, as somebody who's a child of a high school football and wrestling coach and grew up in Nebraska and with the benefits of habituation and hard work, I did go off to college not knowing what I should read and what I needed to learn. And nobody at Harvard really wanted to have a conversation about what we should be teaching and learning and reading. And so I came out of undergrad curious for the first time. I hadn't gone in with the right kind of curiosity, and I wasn't shepherded into an institution that would have a debate about the canon like Bill Bennett and many others in this room wanted to have. And so as a 24-year-old, my wife allowed me to moonlight for a couple of years, and I went back to St. John's in Annapolis and did 2 years of study to read books I should have read as an undergrad. And I'll give the answer of the biggest surprise to me of not knowing what I should read and benefiting from a Western tradition that had some shepherds and guides and mentors. Never in my life would I have thought to read Euclid. And Euclid changed my life. Who knew that you needed geometry as a 26-year-old?
What should the role of the federal government be in alleviating some of the problems in higher education? You've got the student loan issue, Title X, accreditation. What are some things that the Senate and folks in Washington can do to improve the situation in higher education?
Yeah. So I'll just draw two distinctions. I know we're short on time, so there's a lot we could unpack here together for hours, but I'll say two things. One, we should have much greater clarity about why there's a federal role, if there's a federal role. I'm personally a skeptic in the K-12 space at all, and why I believe there is a role for the federal government in higher education. So first of all, we should debate childhood education and adult transitional education. And I think of some of the hortatory uses that Secretary Bennett put the Department of Education to that are amazingly instructive for a moment like this. Though if I could have the federal government out of K-12 altogether, that would be my choice. But inside higher ed, I think we need to have honest fights about what an educated citizenry looks like. Another place that I'm skeptical of the federal government's ability to add much value because of the politicized nature of how those fights will play out and how often the right books and teachers and thinkers will lose. And the fact that I believe the federal government does have an interest in the positive externalities around education, but many more of those are about job retraining in an economy that's going to be much more disrupted. And so I will probably surprise some of you, and because I really do benefit from and learn from so many in this room, welcome future debates and arguments with you. I actually think the federal government's role in higher education should do a lot more to make possible things that don't seem like intellectual education in this class, but I'd like to see more uses of federal government Stafford loans, Perkins loans, Pell Grants for things like welding and other job retraining programs that make it possible for people to be economically sustained, because there are positive externalities around job training and retraining that will never be fully captured by one firm. So I think the federal government does have a vested interest in that.
Great. And the last question, there was you garnered a lot of attention on Twitter recently with some of your tweets about during, I think, Sunday Night Football about the speakership, and maybe that's the Speaker of the House is maybe now that's changed, but it was some great outside-the-box thinking, and maybe you could just give us a little insight into some of your thoughts and some of those tweets for people who don't know exactly about that issue.
Great. Thank you. Good place to close. So let's first of all share the news. About 2 hours ago, Paul Ryan announced that he is going to seek the speakership in the House of Representatives, and I think that's a good thing for America. Paul was the second guy who endorsed me when I ran for office, and so he's a friend and he's a fellow Green Bay Packers fan. Before it was clear that Paul might consider getting into the race, I was really worried about, obviously I sit in the Senate, and so I have no say on who is going to be Speaker of the House, but I am bored by the constant media narrative about establishment versus Tea Party, or, base versus Washington, because the debate is so reductionistic. I think that there's actually happening in our polity fights that are more than three-dimensional, and to reduce it to a singular spectrum fight inside the Republican Party between supposed more moderate or establishment figures and more hardline conservatives misses so much of the complexity and the challenge of the current moment. A second dimension is more of a Burkean versus radical moment. And I am self-consciously, intellectually a Burkean, but I am also dispositionally not a radical or a screamer. I believe that we have big battles to fight to actually persuade people, because the American idea is in crisis, and so many of our folks have never even heard what it is. And so that names a third dimension, which is we are not just polarized and overwrought, though political elites and the nationally attentive are. I think our more fundamental crisis is a crisis of disengagement. That we have so many people who have so little understanding of what it would mean to transmit small r Republican ideals to the next generation, that there is just a drift toward an assumption that government's job is to solve every problem, without any clarity about what governments do and don't do, and what you would do at the federal level versus at the state and local level. And so, having read my 15th article in a week during the time of Kevin McCarthy's nascent speakership, having read the 15th article in a week about the fight between alleged establishment figures in the House and their outsider Tea Party House Freedom Caucus challengers that constantly reduced it to supposedly an ideological continuum, being bored by this, I said, what if we conceived of this fight as more like what it's about? Again, not picking sides in that fight, but as a fight of people who are unsure what to do when there's a crisis of vision. Because the world we really face right now is a world where Madisonian separation of powers is in genuine crisis. Madison said, if all men were angels, we wouldn't need government, and if all governors were angels, we wouldn't need limits on the powers of government, but we don't live in a world of any of those angels. And so we need to do the real hard work of constraining government, and yet we face a world where, I know a joke was made about Donald Trump earlier, where many people who are ostensibly claiming to be conservative think that there's something wonderfully conservative about saying you're indifferent to the means by which ends would be achieved. That is an anti-conservative sentiment, to say I'm indifferent to the way that we would get to an outcome. If I were king or president or prime minister or emperor, I would just decree some outcome. And so I decided to have a little Twitter storm. I usually never talk about politics on my own Twitter account. I talk about sports and whatever plant tour I've recently been on. I'm a curious guy, and whatever I'm learning, I'll use Twitter to kind of document. And I never talk about politics on my Twitter account. But I decided to tweet, what if you had someone for speaker who had the ideas of Jack Kemp, the work ethic of Mike Rowe, the resolve of Margaret Thatcher, and the wit of Larry the Cable Guy? That should be the Speaker of the House. And so I nominated Arthur Brooks to be Speaker of the House from AEI. In the Constitution, you of course don't have to be a member of the House to be Speaker. Arthur immediately shot this down by saying that he did not believe that America was ready for its first bald Speaker. And I will tell you that entrepreneurship and innovation lives in America because over the course of the next few hours, my Twitter account and my email inbox were bombarded with photos of Donald Trump's hair photoshopped onto Arthur Brooks' bald head. America is alive.